This weird new tool is quick.
Yo, what's up, Sean? Dude, for sure. So big at the show. And then also, I've been doing like soccer every day. Those drills you taught me. Yo, what's up, Sean? Dude, for sure. So big at the show. And then also, soccer every day. Those drills you taught me because I just had a bunch of soccer. So I've been practicing mostly the drills you gave me. I just follow patients every week. Kicking the ball, those 2 to 3 drills you showed me. So, anyways, let's keep the sharing going, man. And it's been meaning to reach out, anyways. Thinking about podcast episodes, can we set it in the books? If so, I'm gonna contact more in case that make it happen. Alright, peace and love.
So, give you a quick introduction and get started. Then, what you want to put it for the only thing else is comments without, you know, about 8 people out there, if you use the mic, use that on the discussion. You're not talking.
Okay, you don't have to put the one.
No.
Okay.
No, not mine, like, turn up. You're good to go. So, let's get started. Didn't know, I think that's all really good introduction.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. And welcome to the Any Fret Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Chief at the Pratt Library State Library Resource Center here at the Central Library. This evening, I am pleased to introduce our guest author panelist. This engaging environmental topic. Nicole Fabricant is an anthropology professor at Towson State University. She received a BA from Mount Holyoke College in 1999 in urban anthropology and a PhD from Northwestern University in 2009. She completed a presidential postdoc at the University of South Florida in 2010, where she focused on the global water crisis, and joined Towson University in the fall of 2010. Dr. Fabricant's teaching interests include revolution in Latin America, resource wars of the 21st century, environmental injustice, and gender and labor in Latin America. For the past several years, Dr. Fabricant has been developing a participatory action research project that is presently investigating structural injustices in Curtis Bay, South Baltimore. Her guest is Carlos Sanchez, who is a youth leader and South Baltimore resident focusing on citywide outreach and education to connect more residents with the movement to create community-owned development in Baltimore. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the Pratt Library. And just one footnote, when we get ready to do a Q&A, please make sure that you speak into the microphones because this is being live streamed. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. We just wanted to make sure that you knew that Shashawnda Campbell cannot join us tonight. Unfortunately, she's had a family emergency, but we'll try to bring her into the conversation as much as possible, okay? But we do have Carlos Sanchez with us, who is a current youth organizer with the South Baltimore Community Land Trust. And he's what I would call the third generation of Free Your Voice. And what I wanted to do is just start a little bit with the history of the organizing and then kind of turn things over and ask Carlos some questions, and we'll have more of a dialogue with you all. So Free Your Voice started when there was a proposal to build the nation's largest trash to energy incinerator about a mile from Benjamin Franklin High School. And Shashawnda was going to track for us this after school program that turned into a really important and powerful environmental justice movement in Baltimore. I would say that that was like the first iteration or first generation. When they received a Baltimore Brew article, students could not believe that an incinerator was going to be built less than a mile. And so they really built out this incredible campaign, and Valesco is a part of it. Many people across Baltimore were really galvanized and pulled in early on. This was 2011, 2012. They started by just learning about incineration, and I personally was inspired by the kinds of organizing at 16 or 17 that youth were doing. And so they built out a dream team of experts early on, and there were artists, there were folks that were thinking more along the legal realm, and environmental law was very important. There were public health experts, and the students really used a lot of popular education and dug deep, really deep. I always say that they started by asking some key questions about our political and economic system and why there would be policies that would allow an incinerator to be built so close to communities and so close to their high school. And over time, it was an incredibly successful campaign. When I teach about this, I say it was really a David versus Goliath, because I don't think we ever imagined that a bunch of high school kids would be able to change the fate of this proposal. And over about 2.5 to 3 years, they were able to really begin to negotiate with city officials. Folks had bought into this renewable energy as cheap, easily accessible energy, and that's what they focused on, is how to get public entities to divest. And then eventually they wound up doing civil disobedience at the end, and the City of Baltimore and Maryland Department of the Environment pulled the permit, which was really like the beginning of what I would say evolved into where Carlos and others have come into, which is how do we really begin to define development? So from that incinerator, questions evolved around how do we take back the land? How do we control land in our community? Curtis Bay is an area that's located in the deep south of Baltimore, over the Hanover Street Bridge. And it's been for over 100 years, probably a dumping ground, right? And in the book, beyond what Free Your Voice has done, I was able to collect a lot of archival and historical sources that really track from guano import and export, which was some of the most toxic substances, right? Passing through the lands of the peninsula, to World War I and II era shipbuilding, and looking at labor conditions on the shipyards in Fairfield, to really communities becoming engulfed, right, by industries. And many of those industries in the 60s, 70s, post-World War II were really pretty toxic chemical and fertilizer. Folks in the community would talk about just the kinds of smells that came wafting out. And eventually some of those communities were bought out by the city because it became unbearable, unlivable. So after these youth really took down this plan to build the nation's largest trash to energy, the question became, how do we control development? How do we begin to really define what we want to see in our community? And I think, Carlos, you probably came in around these questions of, it's not enough to take on one toxic industry. We need to be in the driver's seat, right? We need to be making decisions about the fate of Curtis Bay and the fate of the neighboring South Baltimore communities. So I was hoping Carlos could talk to folks about why he joined Free Your Voice initially. You were young, like 14 years old?
Yeah, around that time, yes.
Okay. So what was the impetus? What was the excitement for you around youth organizing?
So at first, I'm gonna be honest, I was recently out of middle school. It was summer, and I was trying to get a summer job. I did not think I would land here where I am today, but I'm really happy and glad that I did. Like I said, I was looking for a job, and the work started to get started with us doing outreach over the summer, talking to residents, and I learned that the way that a lot of people like from my communities are, like it was something going on. Like, for example, I was born with asthma, right? And I was the only one in my family that had asthma. And it was really weird at first. And I thought about it more when I started doing this kind of work, because like I said, I was the only one with asthma. None of my brothers had it. No one in my family and in our generations before me had it. And it just really started to pop a question. And doing this kind of work was, I got to learn that I'm not the only one who's developed asthma out of nowhere. And it's really common for youth and residents around in South Baltimore, low-income communities and communities of color. And doing that kind of work was enlightenment for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where I started getting more involved. I instead of it become more a working environment, it was more educational. And that's what I loved about it, that I got to know more about what's going around in my communities, things that you don't really see, like it just goes past you. And it just opened my mind more, and being able to advocate for those who can't, especially youth who are looked down upon. It just gives me, it's like my spark that keeps me going and made me stick around.
Great. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why fair development or alternative development, because I think the ways in which the early campaign work, it was unfair development, right? It was part of just more toxicity. So really things took a turn when you came in to begin to talk about housing justice, right?
Yeah.
And I know we've talked extensively together about why land trusts as a model for long-term affordable housing in an environmental justice community. Did you want to talk a little bit about fair development?
Yeah, so when it comes to fair development, I would say that, the best way to explain it is that you can't get one and not the other. The housing and clean air are two, human rights that everybody should have. And one shouldn't be offered less than the other simply because of where you're from, what community you live in, and where's your home, where you were raised. And, being able to do fair development means, being able to give them both, like being able to do housing and clean air. And yeah, I'm getting lost, sorry about that. But it can't be, you having clean air and then living in a really vacant home with a lot of mold in it, because then then maybe the outside air is clean, but where you spend most of your time isn't. And you can't have good housing and then terrible air, where then you just don't want to be in your home. It kind of like goes back and forth, and we need to provide both to be able to, make it fair development where nobody will be displaced or be forced to move out in any circumstance.
Yeah, and Carlos came out of a group of high school, a cohort or a class that was actually doing some of the design work for the land trusts. And so I think initially folks wanted to take over a small lot, right? And this was about 2015. Maybe this was a little before your time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And they acquired this lot. And the kids started working with neighborhood design, local architects, thinking about what would we want in this lot, right? And so how would we build recreation or play, miniature golf, a social space? And from that emanated outward towards really thinking about housing options, right?
Yeah.
And from acquiring land, obviously in the book, I track some of the 2020 campaign and a broader kind of affordable housing movement that Free Your Voice and others were a part of, advocating to get on a charter amendment, a certain amount of money, 20 million from the city to build land trusts and affordable housing. But really the eye was always on Curtis Bay. And I think part of the struggle, at least in the class that we talked about with youth, is how Port Covington's development, which it was the largest TIF in the history of Baltimore, is going to begin to infringe little by little upon these communities. So we're already beginning to see in Cherry Hill gentrification, it's being rebranded and named as Middle Branch, and that's creeping towards Curtis Bay. And the youth actually in a cohort in 2015 mapped out, I think it was 520 vacants in Curtis Bay. Who owns those vacants, right? And a lot of the folks are New Yorkers that are buying up whole blocks in Curtis Bay and sitting, waiting for the market to turn. And so youth really became much more involved in this affordable housing movement. And right now we have 15 homes that are part of a land trust that will be passive, ecologically friendly homes. We just broke grounds about a year ago, and the construction will begin. And so part of what Carlos was mentioning about clean air and asthma, the homes are constructed and designed in such a way that it'll make breathing easier. So they are energy efficient, and the homes will be healthier spaces for folks who have respiratory problems. So Curtis Bay has some of the highest respiratory illnesses and asthma in the nation. The zip code is one of the highest.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, as we were designing and thinking about the homes, I think a basketball coach, Shashawnda, always mentions this story when she's with us, couldn't even have a full healthy team of players because of the number of cases of asthma in the high school. So that's an ongoing question for the work, is how to build healthier, more sustainable. So fair development in part was about housing, but it's also about zero waste,
Yeah.
right? So do you want to talk a little bit about the zero waste work and why?
Yeah, so sorry, I thought you were gonna go on from there. But yeah, when it comes to zero waste, we have a Bresco incinerator, really close by. It's on 95, right? You can see it. And we also got a medical waste incinerator. We got an open air coal pile that's literally right across the street from a rec center in Curtis Bay, where kids come around and play. And we got a quarantine landfill. And all of that leads to pollution in the air and great amounts of it too. And there is healthy alternatives. There's alternatives being done worldwide, around the world, who has successfully done it. And the only thing is to bring it here. That has to be done here. And when it comes to zero waste, lost my train of thought, sorry. So with zero waste, let's take in mind plastics, for example, right? All the plastics we think is recycled. And I'm about to ruin a lot of people's, idea, but only, I think it was like less than 2% or 3% of recycling actually gets recycled, and everything else gets burnt in the incinerator. And that's because each plastic comes in, each single-use plastic comes in a different color, shape, form, and you can't really recycle it, because each one uses a different chemical or component to make it the way it is. So the easier option to deal with it is to incinerate it, as well as food waste. A lot of food waste gets burned. 41%, I think, of the waste stream is food scraps or compostables. And take in mind, why incinerate it when you can literally turn it into compost, and you could feed the community. Like what Marvin says is that you can turn into black gold, and you can feed the communities and feed the community, feed the soil. Sorry. And it's just remarkable on how much alternatives that there is to zero waste, and how little efforts are actually being done to achieve it.
So Marvin Hayes runs the Baltimore Compost Collective out of Filbert Street Garden, which is the small agroecological garden in Curtis Bay. And he calls what he does in the garden the Wakanda of South Baltimore. He's incredibly energetic, and really he's been the model for how to scale up citywide composting efforts. So part of fair development is not just housing justice, but it's also alternatives around zero waste, reuse facilities, and really getting the city to divest from incineration. Because recently, under Young, the interim mayor, he signed another 10-year contract for Bresco, which means that we continue to be addicted to incineration. And when I teach about incineration, I think Carlos perfectly stated that most of the county and the city's waste is burned. So our overconsumption in the counties is literally being burnt in places like Mount Winan, which is contributing to high rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses. So the plan was, how do we starve the beast in terms of organizing? So the youth and others began to think about turning the lens on institutions. And about 2 years ago, Shashawnda, Carlos, and a team of folks from Ben Franklin asked if every university could start organizing on our campus instead of in South Baltimore, which was a brilliant strategy, because actually universities produce an enormous amount of food waste, right? And a lot of that food waste, 41%, is being burned. So we started organizing Hopkins, Towson, University of UMBC, UB, some Micah, Loyola, and created an interinstitutional team. And by the end of last year, we got the three major ones, Towson, UMBC, and Hopkins, to commit to sending all their food waste to a local compost site in Curtis Bay. The organizing challenge now is that we need the city and DPW to actually support this green infrastructure, right? And provide some of the resources for building out the site. And this is an ongoing battle with DPW, which we're happy to speak more about. But at this moment, universities are poised to send their food waste, but we don't have a local composting facility. So that continues to be a challenge. I also wanted Carlos to speak a little bit about a recent trip you took. I know this isn't part of the book, but I convinced him to come to Southwest Pennsylvania, and he was just really excited to see the massive petrochemical build out, because where we visited is the new Shell cracker plant in Pennsylvania. And this is where the backbone of our plastics, right, nurdles, are being built. And he couldn't wait to share stories across borders. So thinking about what's going on in Baltimore and then traveling out to Southwest Pennsylvania and sharing with folks who are also fighting for clean air and clean water and an end to the petrochemical industry, which is kind of feeding our one-use disposable plastics model that's then being burned in our incinerator. So it was this beautiful, like, cyclical space to talk about organizing. So do you take anything out of that trip? What are some things that stood out for you?
Yeah, so give me one second. I do have notes because it was a
Great.
lot of information and I just didn't
It
want to
was.
make sure I didn't miss anything. So give me 1 second.
Sure.
Okay, so, what I would pick up is that, there were, like as Nikki mentioned, there's a lot of things over there that's currently happening here, with the pollution, with the coal, incineration, and, there is, ideas on how, it could be better alternatives, but in reality, they're not. There's just, a way to make it seem like they're trying to make a difference, while that, wearing a mask and, not their intention behind it is ways to make more profit, which is something that we all have. Not a lot of people will do anything for the sake of humanity, but mainly for the sake of money and their well-being. So, I mean, in terms of money, sorry. So, an idea that came along was like blue hydrogen, right? Which is supposedly a good, cleaner source, but what it will mean, it will be more in industry, right? And more fracking, which I'm not 100% sure how to explain that, but
I think most people, right, are familiar with fracking for natural gas. So we visited sites where folks are on the front lines, the Marcellus Shale and impact zones, similar sacrifice zones in terms of that is now feeding the petrochemical industry, right? So we kind of traced from fracking to the petrochemical.
yeah, and something that really, that really, confused me is that they would use some of the fracking water, right, to water the crops that they would then sell to residents and say that it's clean and and people would buy it, and it was just really eye-opening on how they would use contaminated water to grow plants and feed them to people. And another thing that really opened me was that some of their productions, I think they said that they had coal drywall and so imagine that, literally having coal in your homes and small particles, you're breathing it in, and you're thinking it's safe to be in your own home. Think about it, you can't even be safe in your own home because of coal is everywhere. It's even now in the drywall. And yeah, I think that's
a lot of just incredible stories, right, from frontline communities, similar kinds of struggles.
Yeah.
And to have Shashawnda or Carlos in those spaces sharing the ways they're organizing, exchanging across geographic space, even in parts of Southwest, you didn't see it, but it's incredibly conservative. It's very rural, white regions. And so I think it does bring up these spaces where we don't often traverse, right? We don't want to have these really hard conversations, but actually many of those folks were dealing with the same kinds of struggles. And we had an Appalachian organizer with us who actually talked about coal, which I think is the last part of what we wanted to discuss because that's the most contemporary struggle in Curtis Bay. But she's helped us to trace from Appalachia coal coming on CSX trains and then winding up at the coal pier, which Carlos mentioned is about 1,000 feet from a recreation center. And CSX, the rail company, has been transporting and exporting the coal. And so again, this question of profit margins, right? CSX is a $19 billion corporation utilizing lands in Curtis Bay to house open air coal community not receiving any benefits from export-oriented coal, but rather ongoing daily struggles about what it means to live amidst coal, to breathe coal, to play in playgrounds where coal is layered, right, on the slides. So to have folks from Appalachia sharing with folks who are beginning to think about what would it look like to build out a massive campaign against CSX, that is our next, I guess, David versus Goliath struggle, really galvanizing and using some of what Free Your Voice has always inspired us, which is popular education, really disseminating to local community, politicizing, because people often say in Curtis Bay that they walk by these facilities, but they're so naturalized, right? You don't notice, you don't think twice about it. You just believe that this is what's normal. And so for folks who might live in Roland Park that have a 20-year more, right, life expectancy than in Curtis Bay, you see a massive coal pier and you think, my God, how is it that a residential community can live amidst this giant coal pile? But for Destiny Watford and for Carlos or for others who have grown up, you walk past it and you just think, you don't even think twice about it. It's very naturalized. So really getting folks to begin to question is what they did so well in those early phases. They really got young people to think, why are we living in such toxicity, right? Who's making decisions that are impacting our everyday lives? How is big money contributing to campaigns? How do we track some of that? And then how do we use that as an educational tool? So I think part of that has always inspired even this more contemporary work. So CSX, did you want to talk a little bit about the coal work and what happened a year ago? We're coming up on the year explosion, right?
Yeah. So around a year ago, the coal CSX coal pile, like I mentioned, is next to a rec center, exploded. You know, I guess the reason was there was a pipeline.
Methane gas
yeah.
buildup, right?
Yeah.
In a silo.
Yeah, and you know, apparently that caused the coal to blow up, and actually, you know, because coal I think is really flammable and really combustible, and when that happened, it shook. Like I live at Lakeland community around that area, and my parents called me. They were like, "Hey, are you okay? Like, did you feel that?" And I was not close by, but the way they explained it is that they felt it, like it was an earthquake. And that was, you know, further away from, a good amount away from Curtis Bay. And I imagine those who were right next to it. And, you know, there was glass everywhere. There was coal on all the cars, all the windows, windows were shattered. And, you know, kids were terrified, especially as well. There was one resident who said that she couldn't communicate with her kid. You know, her kid was so, what was the word, like traumatized. Like she didn't process anything. She was scared, she was frightened, and she couldn't communicate with her child. And you know, when we went to when we went to the city council to, you know, kind of get an explanation on what's going on, that the first time CSX actually didn't show up. And you know, imagine that, you know, trying to get clarification on what's the next steps, how can we avoid this, how can we make it better for the community especially, and you know, the people responsible aren't even there. And at the second time they were there, they had representatives, and you know, the major takeaway was that they said that, you know, if more residents were to, I guess they, you know, complain about it or, you know, say something about it, then, you know, you know, when they can start looking into alternatives and I guess, you know, it kind of, you know, how do I put this, you know, it's surprisingly, you know, why does that have to wait for it to get to a certain amount, how long do we have to wait for another explosion before something gets done? How many more residents have to be traumatized or live in fear on what could happen next until something is actually done? And you know, when it comes to CXS, if there isn't a way to, you know, properly manage the coal where it won't get to the communities, or you know, keep it in where it's at, then there shouldn't be a place for it here. And CSX is a transporting company. They don't have to transport and export coal. They can
Mhm.
do something else, something, that
More
won't harm.
sustainable.
Yeah, more sustainable.
So part of the beginning phases of this campaign is to think about what a just transition could look like. And so community residents, along with lots of other climate justice, Sunrise Movement, eco-socialists from DSA, so many working Green Party in solidarity with Curtis Bay have been coming together to kind of strategize about what it would look like to have stronger standards, right? To protect community health, worker safety, and this shared environment. How do we create pressure upon CSX to really begin to take us seriously and to transition to some kind of other material? And then also environmental reparations is something that's coming out of this. If we're talking about execs that are making millions of dollars, and this is a $19 billion rail company, what would it look like, right, to create a fund that is not controlled by CSX, but the local Curtis Bay Community Association, and that money goes for fair and equitable development. And so I think the city council hearings was the beginnings, right, of investigating CSX and holding them accountable. But really, this is a much bigger escalating campaign that will begin to place serious pressure. So we've had one rally already that was pretty successful, bringing together these distinct groups and local community, heard testimonials at the rally from residents about what it means to live amidst coal. And we have a second big protest coming up this Saturday at 12:30, which is going to be no coal for Christmas. Curtis Bay says no coal for Christmas. And so we will have folks dressed up as Santa with big bags of coal, and we plan to bring it over to the CSX coal pier and create a Christmas card that will be sent out to all the executives. So it's the beginning of kind of creative mechanisms and tactics that have been used elsewhere. Extinction Rebellion actually has been really great around creative and artistic ways of building momentum, right? Galvanizing local community, disseminating, and then keeping the pressure on consistently. And so hopefully over time, we'll see some much more kind of direct action, which is how Energy Answer's campaign around the incinerator ended, with 7 kids occupying Benjamin Grumble's office, the Minister of the Environment at MDE. And actually that civil disobedience was what created a moment, I think, for freer voice of they're actually going to pull the permits and they won't build on this land. So we're hoping that as we build, and escalate, we can see similar kinds of possibilities in the future, right? Yeah. So Carlos, I was asked at Greedy Reads a question that I want to ask you, which is about this upcoming new year. So it was with the Baltimore Beat, and they've done this series of kind of what do you wish for in 2023, right? What are your hopes? So I'm curious, in terms of your organizing efforts, what you would like to see come out of 2023. What's your dream for the city of Baltimore?
My dream for the future city of Baltimore would be, either, completing or, actually start working on building the zero waste facility where, compost, it won't just be for, composting, but it will also be, educational campus where people can learn how to do it in their homes, finally shutting down the incinerators and, kind of moving away from relying on that, like, because it's not our only option. And, I also want to see, more youth, involved. There is a great number, but, the strength is in numbers. So, we can always take in more youth. We can always educate, because, it is true what they say, the youth will be the leaders, and they'll be the ones who will be here in the future, and they will be the ones who, they're the future of this earth, and, we got to leave it ready for them, and we have to make sure we can provide a future for them. Because how can they be, leaders of the future of the city, of the nation, if, you know, if their future isn't secured. And, you know, kind of, that's my hopes for, you know, the future of Baltimore, is that, you know, we start moving away from the depending on incinerations and moving towards zero waste.
Great. So I ended my environmental justice class with Free Your Voice and the inspiration. And I think for a lot of undergraduates who feel really depressed about climate catastrophe and about just like overwhelming debt, college debt, right? All these intersecting crises in their personal lives, but also in the broader world. There's something about the youth organizing and what has been possible in Curtis Bay as a microcosm for what could be possible across our city, but also nationally. Like some of the discussions about Green New Deal, they're actually doing it, right? They've designed it. They've made it culturally appropriate for places like Lakeland or Curtis Bay. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. It's about moving towards healthier, more sustainable, longer-term structures, job creation, good, decent jobs. So I think for a lot of folks, like gaining some sense of inspiration from this movement, gets them out of those dark moments, right, of feeling very cynical. So we were hoping to have more of a conversation with you guys at this point, to open it up, to answer questions. I think Carlos is here, you know, ready to talk about this third generation of Free Your Voice. Valeska was part of that first generation. So, you know, if there are questions, we're happy to engage in more of a conversation at this point.
Mm-hmm.
There are no questions. Sure. Sure. Sure.
So first of all, thank you so much for this incredible book that you've written. I'm excited to read it. And Carlos, it's great to hear your reflections on your work. And I am always inspired by Free Your Voice. I guess one question that I would like to ask both of you, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm curious how to formulate this question. So, Dr. Fabricant, you are a scholar activist, and Carlos, you are a high school student? Yeah. And one of the things that I know is always complex in kind of coalition building around campaigns like this is people who are from the outside supporting communities that are truly affected by the environmental injustice. When I was involved with the campaign, I was definitely an outsider, professor at MICA, artist, developed relationships with people in Curtis Bay. And I guess I'm curious, since I really feel the educational aspect of this evening, are there lessons that you both have learned about how to find a way through that complex relationship of these outsiders that want to support a campaign, but don't have the lived experience that you have, Carlos, as someone living in that community whose family and who's personally affected by those issues? Is that kind of clear?
Yeah. Do you want to start?
It's up to you.
You
Do you
start.
want me to start? Okay, sure. I've thought about this a lot. It's a great question. So I think that at the end, I speak to extractive academia of the book and what I've seen over the years, like 11 years of organizing and taking the lead really from the youth, right? How do we step aside? Eric Jackson, who's a great organizer in Cherry Hill, always says, academics, get out of the way, like give us your money and move aside. And I think that's a brilliant way of thinking about it. How do we use our positionality to amplify, to get resources? I always talk about how important it is to redistribute university resources. So how do we capture those resources without strings attached? Not saying that they owe anything to these universities, we've done enough destruction across the city, particularly Hopkins and Micah, in terms of just displacing communities, that it is well beyond time to think about those resources getting to communities and funding alternative development, but led by and from communities that are on the front lines. So I do speak to some of what I've seen in terms of like service learning or one-off courses in Curtis Bay or Cherry Hill, or the ways in which promotion and tenure work on an incredible treadmill of production that's not about deep relationship building. And for me, solidarity is built in relationships. It's getting your hands in the ground, it's demolishing houses, it's rebuilding, and that's not what academia values. And so it's frustrating, yes. Am I always picking battles and like trying to hold people accountable? Yes, but I think it can be done. I really do, because I have seen it. And I think Free Your Voice is incredible at telling people and directing folks. So there are expertise across the city. We have geographers, we have designers, we have architects who have maybe left-leaning tendencies, but it has to be controlled by the community, right? So like if they could be the ones saying, we need GIS maps, we need you to pinpoint every vacant home. Can you do that for us? It's turning our tools over to movements. And that's where I see the best of like academia, if we can shed our disciplinary norms and even ways of going about it, such that we also redistribute those talents in such a way, then communities control it. So I hope that begins to answer some of it. I'm happy to speak more, but it's something I've thought a lot about in terms of just an extractive model of academia.
Yeah, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but like another part of the question is like how do like outsiders like get out involved as well, and you know how do they? So for me, I think is the best way of learning is like hands-on learning, experiencing it, and you know when it comes to outsiders wanting to be like support it, we always have a need for everybody. Everybody plays a major role in this movement, and there is nobody who can be left out, or if you just come on in, support, come to the rallies, and we do the land trust actually does tours where you can come down and and we'll like give you the more detailed history on how it began, where we at, what's the plans, how we're doing it, and yeah, like just everybody, like I said, plays a role, and everybody can contribute in their own way, and there isn't just one way to contribute, because this fight doesn't just stop at one place. It keeps going, and you can support it in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that recently I've been paying attention to is that some recent articles came out where academics were cited about CSX or about the history of the community. And I always try to hold journalists accountable for saying, go to community members because they know the history, right? Cite folks who are living in those communities, because part of what we build is like an archive that should stay in Curtis Bay, should stay in Cherry Hill, that this is their archive. It's not for universities to hold, right? It's not for libraries to keep behind their vaults. Like this should be community knowledge. And folks that have been leading this organizing work are highly capable of tracing the moments, right, that are critical for journalists to sketch around either toxicity, explosions, sacrifices to the local community. They know it. So instead of focusing on the Cornell scholar or the Harvard scholar who's come in, or the public health guy who's tracing tracking air, talk to residents, right? And maybe like that's part of the role of academics too, is to hold journalists accountable to actually getting those stories from local residents. But I guess also other things that I have struggled with or grappled with in terms of the book is being so deeply involved in this movement has also exposed some of the inequities within our social justice organizations and how we deal with tensions and frictions and how we work through that, right? Without sort of cleavages and breakages, which has happened a lot over and over in Baltimore movements. And so often I think folks coming in don't see those internal conflicts, but if you're in it, you're in it. And you realize that sometimes we're reproducing the same racist, sexist, gendered hierarchies. And is that the kind of world we want to be creating? So how do we deal with this, right? How do we deal with those power differentials within social justice organizations? How do we hold each other accountable? Do we have mechanisms of checks and balances for each other? These are things that I think extend beyond even the coalition building, but our question. And those are the harder, maybe sometimes.
Like I'm really into regenerative agriculture. Really understand why of how like the soil impacts the quality of their food, and how what goes into it is what they get out of it. And so I'm curious, because I'm in circles where I would expect people to be concerned about these things, and they're often just unaware about these things. And you know, is that like something you have to like get past in order to like get people involved? Has it been really easy for people to see, or is that like a big part of your work, like just educating people around these things?
Yeah, so we're used to the way things are, you know, like, and you know, it's kind of hard to change that or try to change that all of a sudden. And sometimes, you know, you gotta you know, start somewhere and gradually build towards it. And certain things that we have in the communities. And yeah, so, you know, we do have some moments where, you know, residents, you're really fine, you know, you just haven't, you know, really and you know, that's kind of when it goes that, you know, you gotta talk to them gradually, find somewhere where, you know, educate, not educate, like, you know, yeah, like I said, like gradually, you know, not everybody is, you know, will see it the same way, like it's been normalized. It's hard to change it. Some like you've been used to it, and you know, yeah.
I think it is an ongoing challenge. In terms of like teaching, right, about the importance of food waste and composting. Marvin's brilliant. If anyone's ever heard Marvin Hayes, he is the example. And if you haven't, go to the Filbert Street Garden and get a composting lesson from him, because he's so energetic. He's so passionate. He teaches you literally, like, how do we compost? Why is it important? He talks about spreading compost fever. And something I've noticed through many iterations of Free Your Voice is just how easy it is to blame the problems of poverty on each other, right? So we get a lot in the classroom and amongst young people. I'm sure some of your friends do this, where it's like, well, you don't take care of the community, or this community is just a dumping ground, or trash fills up because you're lazy and you're what? Like, you know, you throw your trash in the alleys instead of putting it in the garbage cans. And so what was brilliant about the first and second generation is they actually wanted to systemically map inequities, right? Like, so they would do these things called a problem tree, which were the roots of the problem versus the branches. And that is so brilliant, these popular education or Freirean ideas, because it gets students moving beyond individual and behavioral kind of game blaming of one another to see, why don't we get recycling bins? Why doesn't garbage collection come and pick up our bins? What is the system, the broader system of incineration? Who's feeding it? And when you get at those root problems, then I think it's easier to begin to talk about the regenerative, right? Like it's very hard to jump from blaming to like, okay, now let's compost. It's a process to me, I see, right? And also bringing kids to the Filbert Street Garden, elementary age students, middle school, high school students, so they farm and they could see, Marvin calls compost black gold, right? So if you see the black gold and you physically are creating it and then it becomes a soil enhancer, I think those cycles are clearer, right? But if you're alienated from the land and from gardening and from composting, how do you imagine why it's important? So to me, what Carlos said is brilliant about hands-on. That's what I've seen always. Free Your Voice also learns through doing. So like getting your hands in the soil, physically figuring out how to compost, right? Building a lot, like beautiful things, conversations, talk about systemic inequality happened on that land trust lot as they were like demolishing and rebuilding. And that physical and tactile labor is really important for political work. So those are some thoughts. Yeah.
So thank you both for being here and talking about all this. I have sort of a structural question.
Sure.
About Free Your Voice. So could you, because I'm unfamiliar with the organization, could you just explain what the shape of that organization is and like how, Carlos, you interact with it now? Like I really appreciated hearing how you came into it, but like what is your role now? What are you doing?
Sure.
Thank you.
Do you want me to start with the history of
Yeah.
it? Okay. So I just want to briefly, because I didn't have a chance to talk about how it started. I'll give a little of the history and then you could hear about the contemporary through Carlos. It started as an after-school program. So it wasn't a movement, right? It was a United Workers organizer. Everyone has pseudonyms in the book, so I'm going to try to stick with those pseudonyms to protect anonymity, but it is a small community. We all know each other, so probably folks will figure out who these people are. But he basically was a brilliant organizer who was trying to get the young people to just talk about everyday problems in the community after school, to have a space, right? To lean on each other, to talk about homelessness, to talk about drug addiction. Kind of solidarity, right, in this aftercare program. And so he was using this Socratic method of like questioning constantly, and they were building this culture in those early years. So it didn't automatically start around incineration or environmental justice.
When you say early years, what?
2011, 2012, I would say, were the like important early years. And Destiny Watford, who is the real name because she's a big figure. She won the Goldman Award. She wanted her name to be in the book. She was one of the original founders of this after school. She was a brilliant organizer. She led the Energy Answers campaign, wound up going to Towson. But in the early years, she would talk about it just being a friend group, right? A group where they would play games together and do things. And that friendship evolved into much more of an environmental movement. And so when Destiny saw the Baltimore Brew article in 2011, I think, she came to the group and said, look at this, guys, they're about to build a Energy Answers trash to energy incinerator. Let's read about it. And that sparked a more conversation. What's incineration? Let's learn about it. Let's dig deeper. And in the book, I kind of track this because it's hard to really move from that after school to this more political space, right? But it really was that proposal that galvanized, I think, this sense that can we do something about this? Should we do something? What can we do? Because they had a United Workers organizer, and I don't want to underestimate that, right? Like, he was familiar with Freudian political education. He was, you know, doing popular ed type stuff. So he was able to guide them through a process where they were digging deeper. They were using research. They had incredible research on incineration. I show some of their original PowerPoints in my classes, and students are blown away. Like, oh my God, they trace campaign contributions. Like, O'Malley got $100,000 in the Democratic Association when he was governor because he was supporting this big, right? They found that out. They put that in a PowerPoint. They had tracked capital flows. They had tracked interests, right? It was really incredible. And so that's what built out a freer voice, which I would say is more today an environmental justice movement. It's grown. It started with like 8 kids. And now really, I would say, gosh,
There's quite more,
quite
a lot more.
And allies. And it's a bigger, like this CSX Coal we had 65, 70 people, right? I mean, like, we're building something much bigger than just Curtis Bay. It did start there.
Yeah, and in terms of, you know, where it's at now is, you know, right now we're like trying to keep the torch going of what Shashawnda and Destiny, you know, did first started, and you know, that's, you know, keeping the community updated on what's going on, keep on, you know, learning about zero waste and permanent affordable housing. How can we, you know, keep it going, right? And you know, even now, a group of youth actually started their own glass collecting and company, I think, like company or project, and you know, it's where they taking glass from the you know, left in the alleys, and you know, instead of that will eventually be burned, and instead of it, you know, going to landfill or being burned, they pick it up and they make beautiful glass work with it, which they sell, which helps them to, you know, like payrolls for the students, and you know, as well as, you know, help support the development for zero waste and permanent affordable housing. So like, can you imagine that, you know, taking something that's so harmful and dangerous that to something beautiful that people can hold, people can, you know, they have, it's called Baltimore Broken Glass, you know, they have an Etsy as well, you know, if you want to go down and, you know, support. And yeah, you know, it's just, man, you know, keep it going, keep it keep the fire burning, keep the torch on, and being able to pass it on to keep, you know, because this movement doesn't stop, you know, there's always something to do, there's always something to fight for.
And something that's always struck me is the importance of mentorship. So the first generation always mentored the next generation. That social reproduction of organizers is something that's so essential, right? So like Destiny went to Towson, but she still organized full time. She would take a bus 2 hours from Curtis Bay, take her classes, return to the second generation and be there mentoring. Shashawnda started with the incinerator, who's supposed to be here tonight, and now she's heading up the entire zero waste and training this next generation. So it's about a model that the elders kind of mentor, right? A much younger generation, and don't really give up on the organizing, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, it's tireless work. It's exhausting, right?
We're about to wrap up, but I had a question from folks back home.
Sure.
If you could repeat the information about the rally on Saturday.
Sure.
And then if you could also let folks know where they could go online for more information.
Sure.
Do I go down with that?
Yeah. So the rally is taking place at 12:30. There will be an art build at the Curtis Bay Recreation Center, which is 1630 Filbert Street in Curtis Bay. And then the art build will move as a demonstration and a march to the coal pier. So it's probably all in all going to be about an hour and a half or so. We'll return to the Curtis Bay Recreation Center, and community members will speak out about coal. So Carlos is passing around flyers. You can get onto the South Baltimore Community Land Trust website, just Google it, and there's lots of information about the rally on Saturday. But even if you haven't been involved, it's a great low stakes opportunity to have some fun with us, dress up. We're gonna have caroling, some actual Christmas songs that have been all changed to talk about fossil fuels. So I think it'll be a really just fun opportunity. And donuts and coffee and food and great people. So does that help? Yeah.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening to attend this very important topic. And for those who are listening to us virtually, thank you all for attending. This was wonderful. And I think it's very, very important that we save our planet. So this was great. And I'm so glad the youth are involved. So thank you very much. And we have books. We have books outside for signing, so please purchase copies of books that make wonderful holiday presents. So please purchase a couple of them. Thank you again for coming and joining us at Writers Live at Pratt Library.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sure.